Nestled deep in the heart of a vast, untamed forest, the village of Mountain Hollow had long thrived in harmony with the wilderness around it. Surrounded by towering peaks, ancient trees, and winding rivers, the villagers relied on the land to provide for them. They grew their crops, hunted their game, and lived in sync with the seasons, knowing that survival here was a delicate balance. Life was simple, if not always easy. It was a world shaped by nature's fierce, unyielding rules, where strength and adaptability were key. The village was isolated, with no real roads connecting it to the outside world. The nearest town was days away by foot, and even then, it was little more than a small settlement. The villagers had learned to rely on their own ingenuity, creativity, and respect for the land they called home. Agriculture and hunting were their primary means of survival, and they understood the forest as an extension of their own lives. Every tree had a purpose, every stream a rhythm, and every animal, whether it was a deer, a bear, or a fox, was a part of the complex web that connected all life in this mountains of stronghold. But the balance that had sustained them for generations was about to be threatened by a force they could not control. Deep within the very heart of the wilderness that surrounded Mountain Hollow, a grizzly bear roamed the forests and hills, a creature of immense power and presence. He was massive, with a thick brown coat matted by the dust and grime of the forest floor. His fur, once sleek and regal, was now ragged, worn by years of solitary existence. He was a dominant predator, known to the animals of the land as both a hunter and a force to be reckoned with. Once he had been the terror of the forests, his strength unmatched. He had been a king of the wilds, a creature who instilled fear in every animal, who ruled his domain with brute force. But now he had become a shadow of that former glory, his prime years long past. He had been forced into isolation after many long years of surviving the harsh realities of the wild. His battles, both with nature and with man, had left their mark. Deep, jagged scars on his body, his once keen eyes clouded with the experience of a life lived on the edge. The bear was a creature of pure instinct. He was driven by hunger, survival, and the fierce protection of his territory. He was used to being alone, to being self-sufficient, and he lived his days moving through the forests, seeking food and shelter. Though his body had grown frail with age, his instinct to protect was unyielding. There was a calmness to the bear, an almost mystical understanding of the land he called home. Though he had seen and experienced much, there was something different about him, something that went beyond the raw need for survival. It was as though, in the deepest part of his being, he could sense the pulse of the world around him, and it was this connection to the land that made him stand out from the other bears of the forest. For the villagers of Mountain Hollow, life had been predictable, if not always easy. They had learned to endure the rough winters, the unpredictable floods, and the seasonal scarcity. Their lives were intertwined with the land's cycles. But now they faced a different kind of threat, one that no amount of preparation or ingenuity could help them face. The dam that held the waters of the mountain river, a vital source of life for the village's crops and livestock, had begun to show signs of weakness. The heavy rains that had soaked the mountainside over the past weeks had swollen the river beyond its normal levels. Cracks had started to appear in the dam structure, and the villagers, once certain in their safety, were now afraid that a devastating flood was imminent. If the dam failed, it would send torrents of water crashing down the valley, destroying everything in its path. The village, sitting on the river's banks, was at the greatest risk of all. With no way to fix the dam in time, no means of escape should the flood come, and no way to predict how fast it would all unfold, the villagers were left feeling helpless. The destruction of their homes and livelihoods was inevitable. They had no choice but to prepare for the worst. As the floodwaters continued to rise, the villagers began to notice a strange presence near the outskirts of their homes. From a distance, they could see the grizzly bear, wandering through the forest that surrounded the village, moving toward them, watching them from a distance. At first, the villagers were afraid. Bears were dangerous creatures, particularly in times of scarcity. They were known to attack livestock, damage crops, and, in the worst cases, harm humans. But there was something different about this bear. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't hunting. He wasn't even approaching the village directly. He was simply watching, observing. The villagers were unsure of what to make of the bear's behavior. They had never seen him this close to their settlement before. It was as if he were drawn to them. But why? What did the bear want? Some feared that he was a sign of coming destruction, while others began to wonder if there was something more to his presence than simply the instinct to hunt. The old village elder, a woman who had lived through more than her share of the wilderness dangers, was the first to speak. "He's warning us." Her voice was soft, but filled with conviction. The villagers looked at her in disbelief. A bear, warning us. How could he know? But the elder had lived long enough to recognize the strange ways of the wild. She knew the animals, understood their movements, their patterns, and their strange ways of communicating. She had seen this before. When danger was near, the animals would sometimes move in a way that seemed almost intentional. It wasn't just instinct. It was something deeper, something connected to the earth itself. The bear, she believed, had come to warn them. As the days passed, the villagers began to wonder if the elder was right. The bear had stayed near, watching them from the tree line, never making an aggressive move. Some began to believe that he had come to help them, though the idea seemed far-fetched. The idea of a grizzly bear saving a village seemed like a tale too wild to be true. But deep in their hearts, they could feel the change, the strange connection between the wild and the village that could only be explained by the bear's presence. The villagers had always feared the wild, always worked hard to survive against it. Now they realized they would have to trust it. And maybe, just maybe, the wild had a way of showing them that not all predators were enemies. Sometimes even the fiercest creatures could become protectors. The villagers had never experienced a time like this. The threat from the dam, their only water source, was no longer a matter of if it would break, but when. Every night they huddled together in small groups, planning their escape routes, checking their supplies, but none of their efforts could stop the rising tide of uncertainty. The village was on the brink of disaster, and the mountains themselves seemed to be closing in around them. As the days passed, the storm clouds never seemed to break. The relentless rain had swollen the river beyond capacity, the water lapping at the edges of the dam. There were cracks now, deep ones snaking through the stone structure, threatening to split it open at any moment. The villagers worked tirelessly to reinforce the dam, but it was becoming clear that no matter how hard they tried, it wouldn't be enough. They could feel it in their bones, a deep sense of impending doom that couldn't be ignored. The river would soon rage beyond control, and when it did, the village would be swallowed by it. Amidst the chaos and preparation, the bear continued to watch. At first, he was a mere silhouette in the trees, a massive shadow drifting through the forest. But as the days grew more tense, the villagers noticed something odd. The bear wasn't just passing through. He was lingering at the edges of the village, near the riverbank, observing the movement of the floodwaters with great interest. At first, they thought it was merely instinct. The bear, like many creatures, could likely sense the coming danger. But the way he moved was different from how the other bears behaved when disaster loomed. He wasn't scurrying away from the floodwaters like the deer or other animals. Instead, he was moving closer. The old village elder, who had lived in these mountains her entire life, began to wonder if there was something more to the bear's behavior. This wasn't just a predator looking for food. The bear seemed to be sensing something else, something the villagers had missed. One afternoon, as the rain poured down relentlessly, the bear appeared once more, this time near the village's granaries. He was pacing, his massive paws stirring the earth, his eyes focused on the river's edge. The villagers, frightened at first, began to wonder, could the bear somehow understand the danger that approached? The elder, deep in thought, spoke with certainty. He is trying to warn us. At first, no one believed her. But as the days went by, and the bear's presence became more consistent, the villagers began to feel that maybe, just maybe, the elder was right. The bear had not attacked them or even threatened their livestock. He had no reason to stay in such close proximity, yet he did. The night the dam finally gave way was one that would be etched into the memories of the villagers forever. The first signs came with a deafening crack, a sound that shook the very earth beneath them. The river, swollen beyond measure, had broken free from its confines. The water surged toward the village, a wall of destructive force, threatening to consume everything in its path. The villagers had no time to react. The force of the flood was overwhelming. Children screamed as their homes were swept away, and the elderly were too slow to escape the rising tide. In the chaos, no one was thinking clearly. The floodwaters moved too fast, too violently, and there was nowhere for the villagers to hide. The bear, however, was already there. It started with a low growl from the forest's edge. The grizzly had been standing, watching the villagers scramble, when he finally acted. With a speed and strength that had been hidden beneath his weakened frame, he moved swiftly, breaking through the tree line and charging toward the river. The villagers, at first in disbelief, watched in stunned silence as the bear began to move debris from the river's path. Rocks, branches, fallen trees, anything he could push or shift to slow the floodwaters. But the bear did not stop there. He seemed to have a specific goal in mind. He began nudging the earth, using his massive paws to shift the dirt near the riverbank. It was as though he was trying to redirect the flow of the water, to build a barrier between the rushing tide and the village itself. For the first time in days, the villagers stopped running. They stood frozen, watching this mighty bear, the very creature they had feared for years, work tirelessly against the flood, not as a predator, but as a protector. The bear's actions were strange, almost deliberate. It was as though he understood the gravity of the situation, that if the river swallowed the village, it would destroy his territory as well. He was not just saving them, he was saving himself. The woman, standing at the edge of the chaos, watched as the grizzly moved with focused determination, throwing itself into the task with a desperation that mirrored her own. She had seen the bear's power before, but now she was witnessing something more, a strength that went beyond mere survival. This was not a bear protecting itself. This was a creature who had decided to protect the people who had once feared it. The villagers stood in awe, their fear melting into something more profound. They had always regarded the bear as a danger, something to be avoided at all costs. But now as they watched him, they began to understand. The bear wasn't a threat. He was a symbol of the wilderness' deep connection to the village. A reminder that sometimes survival wasn't just about instinct. It was about protecting what mattered most. The woman, her heart swelling with emotion, felt a new sense of gratitude toward the bear. She had never imagined that such a wild creature could stand alongside them, not as an enemy, but as an ally. She couldn't explain it, but she knew in the depths of her soul that this bear was saving them. The night had descended, thick with the urgency of the impending disaster. The rain was relentless, pouring from the sky in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. The villagers scrambled for higher ground, their homes already washed away by the swelling river. But amid the chaos, one figure remained steadfast. A grizzly bear, working against the rising tide with a determination that seemed beyond the scope of instinct alone. The floodwaters, once simply a threat, were now an unstoppable force. The dam had broken, and the surge of water had already claimed parts of the village. The grizzly, sensing the full extent of the danger, moved faster than anyone thought possible for a creature of its size. With his massive claws, he tore through the underbrush, clearing debris and redirecting the flood's path. It was a desperate attempt to keep the waters from overtaking the people. But despite his strength, the bear was still weakened. His body, scarred from years of surviving the harshness of nature, had not fully healed from the wounds of his past. Yet there was something deep inside him, a primal force that refused to yield. He had made a choice, to fight not just for himself, but for the people who had feared him. The river, relentless and unforgiving, continued to rise with every passing minute. The bear, already exhausted from his previous efforts, was now facing the full weight of the flood. It wasn't just the water that threatened them. It was the landslide triggered by the rain, which was now tearing through the mountainside above them. The villagers had seen the signs of the shift. The earth had started to rumble, and when the landslide hit, it would be their final test. The bear, still moving with purpose, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He was no longer fighting the floodwaters alone. He was preparing for something much worse. The mountain itself was about to collapse. The massive weight of falling rocks and soil could crush everything in its path. It was a force beyond what any of them could survive. The woman, standing at the top of a hill, looked down at the grizzly. Her heart ached as she saw his efforts. He was holding the line, but he was only one creature against the overwhelming power of nature. She knew that the landslide was inevitable, and in that instant, she realized that this was their final chance. The village was at the brink of destruction, and the bear's strength was all that stood between it and complete annihilation. The woman made a choice. She would do everything in her power to protect him. She had to keep him alive. They both had to survive. With urgency, she gathered the remaining villagers, urging them to take refuge in the only safe area left, the hill that overlooked the village. As the grizzly labored in the distance, clearing the remaining debris and redirecting the flow of the water, the woman knew time was running out. The roar of the landslide came suddenly, deafening and unstoppable. The earth shook, and with a violent crash, rocks and trees came tumbling down the mountainside. The villagers had barely reached the safety of the higher ground when the earth erupted beneath them. The bear, standing firm against the tide of the river, turned toward the mountain as the landslide approached. His massive body was already battered, his wounds fresh, but he stood tall. The woman, standing close behind, could see the defiance in his eyes, the way he refused to retreat. This was his home. This was his fight. The landslide came roaring down, tearing through the trees and ripping apart everything in its path. The water, once a threat, had become part of a greater force that seemed unstoppable. But the grizzly did not move. He stood with his paws planted, staring down the oncoming storm. He used every ounce of his strength to clear the debris, guiding the villagers to a safer point on the hill. As the rocks crashed down around them, the bear took the full brunt of the landslide, his body enveloped by the fury of the earth. The woman cried out in desperation as the bear was knocked off his feet, his massive frame swept away by the landslide. This was it. The bear had given everything, but now it seemed like even his strength wasn't enough to stop the world from collapsing around them. But then, against all odds, the grizzly stood again. He rose, bloodied and battered, but unbroken. His strength, though diminished, was still a force to be reckoned with. He gave one final roar, a sound that echoed through the mountains. And with a movement that seemed driven by pure instinct, he pushed the remaining boulders out of the path, ensuring the village was safe from the worst of the destruction. As the dust began to settle, the woman rushed to the bear's side, her heart heavy with relief and sorrow. He was badly wounded, his body bruised, battered, and covered in blood. But he was still alive. The landslide had not taken him. He had fought, and he had won. The villagers gathered around, stunned by the enormity of the bear's sacrifice. They had seen the grizzly as a threat, something to be feared, but now they saw him for what he truly was, a protector, a savior. The woman stayed by his side through the night. She had never imagined that she would be here, beside a bear who had saved her, alongside people who had once feared the very thing that had brought them their salvation. The storm raged on, but the floodwaters had receded, and the village, though battered, had survived. As the dawn broke the following morning, the woman sat quietly beside the grizzly. She had been through so much, had come to the wilderness to escape pain, only to find something more. She had found a friend in the wild, a creature who had shown her that there was more to the world than survival and instinct, that there was honor, sacrifice, and loyalty in the most unexpected places. The bear had given everything to protect them, and now in his quiet strength, he was showing her the true meaning of survival, not by fending off enemies, but by embracing the wild and everything it had to offer. She had come here alone, but now she knew she wasn't. As the bear slowly got to his feet, the woman realized it was time. He had earned his freedom. The grizzly had done what no one else could, and now he was ready to return to the wild, his true home. Before he disappeared into the forest, he turned and looked back at her. One final glance, a silent thank you. The woman watched as he walked into the forest, his silhouette disappearing into the trees, leaving behind a legacy of courage, sacrifice, and the wild's unbreakable bond. The first rays of dawn pierced the heavy, fog-covered sky, shedding light on the aftermath of the disaster. The village of Mountain Hollow, though battered and scarred, had survived. The floodwaters, once a violent force threatening to erase everything, had finally receded. The mountain had given way to its own fury, tearing through the earth and swallowing up homes, but leaving behind an uncertain stillness. The villagers, now safely perched on higher ground, began to take stock of what had been lost. Houses, fields, and crops, all the years of hard work were gone. Yet there was a collective sense of relief that ran through the people. They were alive, they were safe, and in their hearts they knew that their survival had come at a price. The bear had paid that price. The grizzly had not survived the full force of the landslide. After his final act of bravery, when he had pushed the remaining debris away to protect the villagers, the earth had overwhelmed him. The woman who had stayed by his side throughout the ordeal had seen his last breath. He was still, motionless, his once powerful frame now a shadow of its former self. His body had borne the brunt of nature's wrath, and in the end the landslide had claimed him. The villagers had witnessed the sacrifice from a distance. When the floodwaters subsided and the full extent of the destruction became clear, they found themselves in awe of the grizzly's courage. It had been the bear's actions, the bear's unyielding will to protect, that had kept them alive. The landslide had devastated their homes, but it had spared their lives. The woman, overcome with grief and gratitude, walked through the wreckage, searching for any trace of the bear. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the forest, where the last of the landslide had settled, that she found him, still there, his body broken, but his spirit alive in the memories of those he had saved. It was an image that would forever stay with her. The grizzly, a creature of raw power and untamed instinct, who had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the very people who had once feared him. As the days passed, the village began to rebuild. It was a slow and painstaking process, with every home needing to be reconstructed, every field needing to be replanted. But despite the heavy loss, there was a sense of purpose in the air, a sense that the village had come through something greater than just a storm. They had been saved not by their own hands, but by a creature of the wild who had, against all odds, chosen to protect them. And so the villagers decided to honor the bear's sacrifice in the only way they knew how. Together they gathered near the edge of the forest, where the bear had fought to protect them. They cleared a small patch of ground, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of the wilderness. With heavy hearts and hands stained by their labor, they erected a simple monument, a small stone, carved with the bear's image and the inscription, "In memory of the grizzly who gave his life for our survival. May his strength be a reminder of the courage and sacrifice that lives within us all." The monument was not grand, nor was it meant to be. It was simple, just like the bear. But it was a testament to the deep respect the villagers had developed for the bear and for the wild that had given them life. It was a tribute to the understanding that survival was not just about taking, but about giving back to the land that sustains all living things. The transformation of the villagers' perception of the bear had been nothing short of profound. At the beginning of the disaster, they had feared the grizzly, seeing him as a threat to their safety, their livestock, and their way of life. They viewed him as a creature driven solely by instinct, a beast that could never be tamed, never understood. But now, after witnessing his bravery and the sacrifice he had made, their fear had melted away. They no longer saw him as a danger, but as a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and selflessness. The bear had shown them that the wild was not something to conquer. It was something to respect, even love. The villagers had always feared the unknown forces of nature. They had never truly understood the deep rhythms of the land. But now they realized that the land was not just a provider, but also a protector. And in that protection, they had found something greater than survival. They had found a connection, a bond, to the world around them that went beyond what they had ever imagined. The villagers began to understand the bear's role in the ecosystem, in the cycle of life that governed the mountains and forests. He was not a creature to be feared, but one who had played a vital part in the balance of nature. Through the bear's actions, they realized that the wild was not just a place to take from, it was a place to be part of, to be in tune with. In the years that followed, the village of Mountain Hollow flourished once again. The homes were rebuilt, the crops regrown, and life returned to a sense of normalcy. But no matter how much time passed, the memory of the bear's heroism would remain etched in their hearts. The villagers would gather around the monument in the years to come, sharing stories of the grizzly who had saved them. Children would listen, wide-eyed, as their elders spoke of the time when the wild had come to their aid. They told the story of the bear not as a warning, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from domination, but from sacrifice. The villagers would pass down the story to their children, ensuring that the legacy of the bear would never be forgotten. They would tell their grandchildren that even the wildest creatures, those driven by primal instincts, could become something greater than themselves, a symbol of protection and selflessness. The woman, now older and wiser, stood by the monument one quiet evening, her thoughts drifting back to the days of the flood, to the roar of the landslide, and the sight of the bear standing firm against the rising tide. She had come to the wilderness to escape, to heal from the wounds of her past, but in doing so, she had found something greater than she could have ever imagined. The bond she had forged with the grizzly had taught her that survival was not just about taking, but about giving, giving everything for those who need it, whether they be human or animal. As the sun set over the mountains, casting the valley in a golden light, the woman closed her eyes and whispered a final thank you to the bear who had changed everything for her and for the village. And in the quiet wind that passed through the trees, she could almost hear the bear's roar, echoing through the mountains. A reminder that the wild, though fierce, could also be kind.